So without further ado, it's Rebecca Roanhorse. So the first thing that we were going to do is she was going to read an excerpt from her book, and then we'll throw it open right away to Q&A if you guys have any burning questions, and if you don't, I have a long list, so.
Should I stand at the podium or should I just sit?
Whatever you prefer.
I guess I'll sit. I guess, why not? Okay, so this is this is the ARC.
Yeah, so typos are still in that one.
Do we have an actual?
Yeah, does somebody have their copy then?
That I can borrow just for the read?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
So
That's okay.
Oh, you got it.
It's better if I have this. Okay, so before I start, I'll say a little bit about the book. Obviously, the book is called Trail of Lightning, and the elevator pitch was an indigenous Mad Max Fury Road. I know. Oh, I should use this, shouldn't I? My bad. Am I good? Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, that's a pretty badass elevator pitch. I did not come up with that, my editor did. So, props to Joe Monty. And so this is sort of a breakneck, apocalyptic adventure through the Navajo reservation. But it is post-apocalyptic, I should say. And the Navajo Nation has risen after calamitous climate change, and now it has become one of the better places to live. And so all the things that sort of made reservation living hard now make the people there survivors. And the story follows Maggie Hosky. She's the protagonist, and she is a monster hunter. And when the story opens, she has been in isolation for a while after a very bad relationship with a demigod, let's say. And so she's coming out of hiding, sort of, to help a small town find a missing little girl. And I'll start there. Chapter 2. I follow the easy tracks, broken branches and grass shine, up the mountain for over an hour, with no visual on my prey. I keep moving anyway, sure of my path, and for a moment, lost in the beauty of the waning sunlight and the steady rhythm of my breath, I forget I am here to kill something. The forest surrounds me, ponderosa and blue spruce spread across the high desert mountains, sheltering small badgers and mice and night birds. Pine trees scent the air, their fallen needles crunching softly under my feet. Insects drone happily in the cooling evening, buzzing near my ears, attracted to my sweat. There is a beauty here, a calmness that I savor. I will savor the bloodshed too, no doubt, but this balance between earth and animal and self feels right, feels true. The sun sets, the moon rises, and the night settles in thick around me. The trees become shadows, the creatures flee from night predators, and the insects fly away. My pleasure fades along with my daylight. I keep moving until the stench of corruption grows so strong it becomes overwhelming. Dread, like a dark intuition, builds in my stomach, telling me I must almost be there. I swallow my fear, my mouth dry and sour, and keep going. I run my hands across my weapons again, just to make sure. A flicker of light ahead on the path catches my eye and draws me closer. I hunch down and move in for a better look. A campfire flutters and shivers, casting haphazard flames against the trunks of tall trees. The fire tries its best to rise high, but it's just a bunch of loose sticks and thrown into a shallow dugout, quickly consumed and not up to the task. I circle south to come in somewhere downwind and east of the camp. I load my shotgun with shells full of corn pollen and obsidian shot, both sacred to the Tene. Ammo meant for taking out the Yi Nagoshi, the Chidi, and any of the other monsters that call Tene Ta home. If I'm wrong, and this monster is of the more common human variety, the ammo will work just fine on him too. A hole in the heart is a hole in the heart, no matter what makes it. I find a good spot, foliage providing me cover, but not breaking my sight line into the camp. and I brace the shotgun against my shoulder. I sight down the barrel. What I see turns my stomach. The monster looks like a man, but I know better. He lies stretched out on a blue sleeping bag under a makeshift lean-to, rough canvas tarp strung across 2 ponderosas with trading post twine. The bulk of his body hides the girl from view, but I can hear her, a low, whimpering mewing as his mouth works at her neck, and she begs him to stop. He doesn't stop. Rage floods my body, turns my vision hazy as I fight a wave of memory. The remembered feel of a man's weight holding my own body down, blood thick and choking in my mouth as powerful fingers grip my skull and slam my head into the floor. A strong smell of wrongness in my nose. The memory shudders through me, makes my hands unsteady. I force myself to shake it off, remind myself that it's just a memory and can't hurt me anymore. The monster that did that to me is dead. I killed him. I spare one last hope that Nizgani will come charging up the mountain, flaming lightning sword aloft to save the day. I even wait half a second to see if it'll happen, but nothing. Just me, alone. I raise the shotgun, bracing it against my shoulder. I stick out a foot, eyes still focused in front of me. I step heavily on a fallen branch. The brake sends a loud snap into the otherwise silent night. I wait for him to move, to give me a clear shot. Zilch. Eyes still set on the monster's back. I reach down and pick up a rock. I throw it hard against a distant sumac. It smacks into the trunk with a loud thunk. I grip the shotgun, finger on the trigger. Still nothing, and the girl's cries get higher, more frantic. Screw it. I bang the butt of my shotgun on the tree I'm using for cover and yell, "Hey, over here!" He rears up, head jerking back and forth as he searches the night for me. The nearness to the fire has left him blind. I swallow down bile. His mouth is covered in red gore. He's been gnawing at her throat. The son of a bitch is eating her. I fire. The shot rips through his chest. He staggers but doesn't go down. Blood trickles sparkling wet in the firelight and then pours. I start counting down from 10. 10 seconds and a human loses enough blood that he falls like a brick. I know he's only shaped like a human, but I hope the rule still stands. I stay alive for 10 seconds, and I win. He's big, broad-shouldered, and thick. No wonder he was able to carry the girl up the side of the mountain for miles. In the flickering light of the poor fire, I can't see much detail. Man-shaped, but with knotty lumps like oversized tumors protruding from his back, shoulders, and thighs. Arms that seem too long, that branch out from his trunk and drag the ground. Skin so translucent it almost glows. And now he's sporting a bloody hole in his chest. I pump and fire again, this time taking off a chunk of his shoulder. Flesh and other bits spatter down on the girl, who skitters backwards on all fours. The monster is still standing, and he roars at me like a wounded boar, enraged. "Run!" I shout at the girl as I advance. 6, 5, 4, and he barely staggers with a hole in his heart and half his arm missing, and I know I'm in trouble. "Go down," I whisper, "go down." Stop there.
So in a moment, Sid will be here to handle the corded mic. So once she's here, we can...
Use the rope.
Oh, okay. Yeah, if we want to pass that around. Does somebody want to volunteer to handle the mic, though? Great. So by all means, I am fortunate enough that I get to spend time with Rebecca, once a month or so, because we're in the same writers group. So by all means, if you guys have questions, you guys get priority. Does anybody at this point have any questions you'd like to ask? Yes?
The book is so short because she dies right there, right?
The rest is blank pages.
We shift to the monster's perspective. It's sort of a Grendel thing.
Yeah. No, it's not.
No, it's not.
Yeah, there's another heart-stopping scene, or heart-stopping moment in that scene that you stopped before. So. Yeah.
I can do a little more later.
Yeah. There's time. So let's talk a little bit about representation in fantasy. I'm hoping this is the start of a wave of more representation in fantasy. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and your thoughts on the matter?
Sure. Okay, so I don't know how many of you are fantasy, science fiction and fantasy fans to begin with, but you probably have never or very rarely seen Native American representation in science fiction and fantasy. And if you have, then that person is usually half native, and maybe they're a shapeshifter, and maybe they're caught between two worlds, and there's not a whole lot of like cultural relevance to their nativeness. Often they're isolated from their cultures, things like that. And so what I wanted to do was write a book that felt very Navajo to me. I'm not Navajo. I am Okewengay Pueblo on my mother's side, but I lived on the Navajo reservation for a couple of years, and I married a Navajo guy who's somewhere. We lost him, but he's around here somewhere.
He has cake, so be nice
But
to
he
him.
has cake, so we're gonna let him stay.
He's caught between two rooms.
Yeah. And I just wanted to capture some of what I knew about the reservation, what I knew about being indigenous and having an indigenous experience, so to speak. And so but I knew I also wanted to be post-apocalyptic, and I wanted it to be fun. So and so there are levels, I think, in the book. I think one of the levels is, yes, this is representation. The other level is, this is just like an all-out monster hunting adventure. But it is set squarely in Navajo cosmology. All the gods and heroes and monsters come from Navajo traditional stories. But I tried to be very careful about what stories I did choose from. I tried to choose ones that other Navajo creators were already working with. Like there's some great comic book artists working with the hero twin stories. And so I focused on like the hero twin stories. Or there's other stories that I reference in there with Coyote and characters like that, and those are all stories that are sort of in the public imagination already, because I didn't think it was my place to tell Navajo stories not being Navajo. Also, on top of that, just to sort of add this is a fantasy story, so this is not a book you read to learn about Navajo culture. This is a book you read to like learn about monster hunting, you know? So, yeah, so it's based in the culture, but it's certainly not a premise.
Well,
Also, the fact that
Does somebody want to actually get the microphone?
I was just wondering if adding on to your thoughts, I guess, about being a woman and writing from this. I guess adding on, I don't like the static. Adding, not only being native writer and from that perspective, but also from a female perspective. I don't see women, I don't see natives in science fiction or fantasy, and so it's very exciting. And even just in that passage, shifting from this flashback of abuse past, like to back to fantasy and monster hunting, like that's something I imagine I did. So
Right.
yeah, how do you see that?
Sure. So one of the things, I think also as you read the book, like I said, it has layers. And one of the things I did was base the magic system in trauma. Because I wanted to speak to, so the character has PTSD, clearly, as you'll see as the story goes on. And she's fighting a lot of her own internal monsters, right? And trying to decide whether she is a monster. Because, if you're going to go through this sort of violence, I didn't want that violence to be flipped. It actually has a purpose. And part of that purpose is, for her to figure out what the hell she's doing. And so being a woman, I think also a lot of the trauma that she comes from, it comes from this relationships that she has with this mentor, Nizgane, who I mentioned, who is a hero out of Navajo legend, and just with the post-apocalyptic setting and what comes from that. And I wanted to make sure that was very centered. I think also in the Native world, I don't know if you guys have heard of like the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement. Yes. But it's 1 in 3 Native American women have been the survivors of violence in their lives. Yeah. And thousands go missing every year in Canada and in the United States, and nobody ever hears about it. We never talk about it, it never makes the news. And so that was something that I knew coming into this book. And so I think that sort of sensibility filters into.
Yeah, one thing I'll say about that is there's a scene that it is gut-wrenching. You see a lot of people have been killed. But what was also gut-wrenching is I thought, how often does this happen? And we just kind of don't hear about it, you know, or it's sort of a sidebar on the news. Yeah. So why don't we talk a little bit about the magic systems? Like you said, it is based in trauma. What was your kind of inspiration beyond that for how it works and the mechanics?
Look, coffee.
Sorry, from your husband.
Oh,
Forgive me.
such a good When you brought me a snack.
Sorry.
We have the coffee, really. So the magic system, right? So fantasy books, you know, they all. What kind of makes them fantasy is that there is some element of magic, right? But I wanted to be very careful about the magic that I used because often when you tell a Native American story, spirituality somehow becomes quote unquote magic. And I didn't want that to happen. I wanted spirituality to stay spirituality. That's part of the culture. That's just as true as any other religious experience of any other culture. And then I wanted magic to be magic. And there is a medicine man character. The main character has a sidekick who she's going to pick up along the way, and he is a medicine man. And so,
a really hot medicine man.
Hey, I'm writing the book. If I want to make the guy hot, I can make the guy hot. So what I wanted to do with the magic system is explore the idea of can anything good come from suffering and come from this sort of deep trauma. And I don't really answer the question, and the characters don't all agree. It's like an ongoing sort of conversation. But that idea of like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or you know, the willow that survives the wind, or whatever that metaphor is, that something good can come from something bad. And so from Maggie's trauma and from other characters who have these powers, which I call clan powers, from their trauma come superpowers. So she didn't use them yet in this scene, but she does have 2 superpowers based on her clan affiliation in Navajo culture. So in Navajo culture, you have 4 clans. I only used 2 because it was a lot. And so each of the characters who have these clan powers that arise from trauma, they are distinctly tied to their Navajo clans. And they are specific to the trauma that they suffered.
Right, because Maggie's is Living Arrow, and what's the other clan?
Walks around.
So that makes her a monster slayer.
Yeah, so that makes her deadly and it makes her fast.
Yeah. Got a question up here.
I'm sorry about the tripod. Thank you, everybody, for not moving over the tripod there.
Oh, is it really loud? My mic's really staticky?
Yeah. I don't know. I can try without. Am I okay without?
Yeah. So I apologize.
I just wanted to ask, you brought up a lot of things as a Native writer and being a woman, and sometimes I think a lot of writers don't get published because they don't want to pass what you were calling spirituality and fantasy. So my question is, you're not Tene, but you're from Owenge.
Mm-hmm.
So did that account into why you didn't tell it from that perspective? Because
Why Navajo?
why Navajo and not from Oke?
Uh-huh.
And that, because you know that you probably have more knowledge from Owenge versus Tene if you lived in the community. So how much of that went into your writing instead of choosing?
Sure.
Choosing.
Sure. So I actually have never lived in the Okewinke community, but I have lived in the Navajo community, so that was part of it. But some of it was logistics, it was practical. If you've ever been to Okewinke, you know how small it is, and there's only a certain number of people. This is an epic fantasy. They have to drive around in that truck. They have places to go. And I needed space, and so some of it was practical. Like I'm sure most of you know, the Navajo Nation is in the 4 corners. It covers, 4 separate states. It has 250,000 members. It's huge. And so that worked much better. Also, a lot of Navajo stories, like I mentioned, the hero twins that other artists are working with, are more public than the Okewinke stories. And I didn't want to be telling stories I shouldn't be telling, or working with stories I shouldn't be working with. And Pueblos are a little more private about their stuff. And so I didn't want to upset anyone there.
Do you have any other questions? Right here.
You could just as easily have made her a monster killer, etc., without being in a post-apocalyptic world. Yeah, I understand that it makes it more interesting, but there are other aspects to the normal world if you would have put her in that setting. So how did you go around making that choice?
Well, I did want to say something, I guess, in the book about the impact of climate change. I wanted to say something about the survivors of a genocide. And I felt as a Native woman and Native person, you know, our apocalypse happened 100 years ago. Started in 1492, I guess, you know, and it's still ongoing, but in my book, the rest of the world, you know, sort of goes to hell in a handbasket, but, you know, the Navajo Nation is okay. They're pretty good. And so I wanted that reversal. I wanted that feel of what seems dire and the end of the world for the non-Native community, especially outside the reservation, doesn't feel that way to us because we've already been there. We know what that's like. We know what it's like for you to take our children and put them in schools. We know what it's like for the environment around us to be destroyed. We know what it's like to have pipelines laid on sacred land. And so I wanted to capture some of that and talk about that too. And in the book, there are characters that there is part of the apocalypse that happens before the book starts. There is an energy war, and there are people who are on the front lines of like a pipeline war, essentially. And there is a veteran of that who is a character in the book, and you get more into that in like book 2 and things like that. So I did have something to say about, I guess, sort of the world, you know, that we're living in, and what that might look like. And I think that I wanted that apocalyptic feel to it. Yeah.
Well, and another interesting thing is that, you know, so this is a series and it's called The Sixth World. And what I really like about that is far too often people think of Native history as kind of being over already, you know, and this presents it as very much an ongoing, continuing, as it is in the modern day. Do you want to talk a little bit about what Sixth World means? I mean, those of you who know about indigenous culture will already know, but for those who don't.
Yeah, so just briefly, so the Navajo have an emergence story, as like a creation story. They have an emergence story, and in that story, the Navajo come up through various worlds, and each one has been destroyed by some sort of cataclysm, and then they move through the worlds. And some people say now that we're in the 5th world, depending on where you are on the reservation. Some people say we're in the 4th world because stories change depending on like location. It's a big place. But I was told that we were in the 5th world, that's the glittering world, and that's the world we live in now. And it made sense that when this world ends, so to speak, that we would move to the 6th world.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Yes, sorry. How many books are planned in the series?
It's a 4-book series. So 2 are written. Trail of Lightning and Storm of Locusts comes out next year in April. And just so you know, Trail of Lightning takes place all inside the wall. So the Navajo Reservation, Denigta has risen, and they built walls around to keep...
Very cool magical wall.
Yeah, but to keep the riffraff out, right? Yeah, so that's a little bit of a social commentary there. But they live inside the walls, and in Storm of Locusts, they venture outside, and you get to see a little bit more of what happened to the rest of the world. But I wanted to focus, to start the story, I wanted it focused in you know, sort of placed distinctly in Navajo, and then we'll move from there. The second book takes us, what I say, on a girl gang post-apocalyptic road trip down Route 66. Wow. So we're going to go see the rest of the world, and we're going to run into some newborn casino gods and some cult leaders that have a thing for locusts and, you know, stuff like that. And then the third book actually will take us to Albuquerque, which is the Boracay now, which is like a place of like sort of city-state, powerful land grant families and sort of interesting things like that. So we're going to play with that. And then the fourth book, I won't tell you what's going to happen. Because I'm not sure. No, I know.
That's our plot.
Yeah, my editor would kill me, right?
Hey, Rebecca.
Tony?
I want to preface this by saying I'm super proud to see you up here, and I got just a couple minutes late, but I wanted to just sort of remark on what it might feel like in the process of writing, because often with writing and certainly with artwork and different muses that everybody have, it can often be prophetic. Like it can actually look forward into the possibilities. If you look at like a Fritz Lang's film called Metropolis, which is as current and relevant today in the politics of the here and the now as it was way back when. And so when you're writing, you have at your fingertips all of this new information, which is could be from social media, it could also be from the internet, news, Fox television, wherever you get the information. And so you can take that and channel that into the book. But at a certain point, with it being fantasy, you also have the liberty to create from that. So I wanted to ask the question about how does it feel to be able to have all the information that we have right now at our fingertips, putting that into a creative place that we have free license to do whatever we want to. And at some point, can we divisively look at, see, I'm different. I want to look at the strategies. How do we change and affect and influence? What is it, propaganda? Or how do we use writing or art as a tool to like inform people, to give some insights about global climate change? So in a way, it's power, right? But then also, what does that feel like? Is there a sense of responsibility that you have? Do you have an agenda to address all of these things on a social political kind of? It sounds a little like that there's some things you feel like is necessary, pertinent to address.
Right.
Maybe I'm talking too much, but I just thought, you get what, it's not really a question, it's just like stimulus for dialogue. That's it.
Right. I guess a couple of things. I feel a huge responsibility because, quite frankly, there are no native writers writing in science fiction and fantasy published by the Big Five, which are the Big Five publishing houses. There are some awesome native writers writing in indigenous futurisms, which is sort of like what we call it, but they don't get a lot of as much play as they should. So you often have to seek them out. But they are there and they are writing. And I'm going to sort of segue that into, I wrote a short story recently called Welcome to Your Authentic Indian Experience.
Which won the Nebula.
And it won the Nebula, yay! Which is a big science fiction nerd thing, so that's awesome.
It's a big deal.
Yeah, it is also nominated for a Hugo, which is even a bigger science fiction nerd thing.
First ever published short story.
And it was.
Fortunately, she's a very likable person, otherwise everybody would hate you.
Yeah. Right here they hate me. If you check Goodreads, yeah, they hate me. So, but you need haters or else you're not doing anything, right? So, and so that story was solicited by Dr. Amy Sturgis. She was doing a special issue of Apex magazine on indigenous futurisms. And so she reached out to native writers and asked them to submit a story. And she picked 4. And so there were 4 of us in there. They're all women, they're all science fiction fantasy writers, and they're all Native or First Nations. And that's incredible. Like, did people even know, we were writing? Probably not until that magazine came out. And then when my story got the attention that it's gotten, which is awesome, the most awesome thing about it is that people go and read that magazine. And they see that there's 3 other Native women writing science fiction and fantasy. And so I think my biggest sort of agenda is representation. Is that I want all the Native stories, and I want all the perspectives, and I want us all to be able to tell our own stories and our own voices and redefine sort of the typical tropes that you see when people tell Native stories. Like Emily said, Natives are usually dead. Or they're on their way, or they're dying. It's like the 1800s, and, you're gazing into the distance, and here comes, civilization and the white man. Or
they're a character
Yeah, or
some
they're,
deep mystical connection to nature.
yeah, and I want none of that. That doesn't interest me at all. And that's fine if other people want to tell those stories, but I'm not going to be the one telling those stories. I want to see Native characters in the future. I want to see us now and continuing on. And I want it to be powerful stories that play out in tons of different ways. Like, just to step back a minute to that, Welcome to Your Authentic Native American Experience. If you guys haven't read it, it takes place in a, I guess I'd read near future Sedona, Arizona. The main character actually is Pueblo in that story, and his name is Jesse, and he works for a virtual reality company that sells essentially native experiences to non-natives. So they can come in and they can go through the virtual reality thing and they can live out their native fantasies. And they're often, of course, very stereotypical, you know. And so, you know, Jesse.
To put it mildly.
Yeah. So, you know, Jesse
There's
ends up.
an actual how greeting
Yeah.
in there.
Jesse ends up on a plane, you know, very rugged with the abs and the, you know.
He's
the,
giving people native names.
Right, right. And there's, you know, but there's a lot to that. What I'm trying to say about society and representation, you know, to sort of go back to what you're saying, Tony, is you can use science fiction and fantasy to slip in sideways, I think, to a lot of issues. You don't have to have an agenda that you spell out necessarily, or that you beat people over the head with, or, you know, that you even, I think there's more freedom in science fiction and fantasy to talk about these issues without it feeling like you're getting lectured, quite frankly. So you read this story about Jesse, who is a hot mess too. He's not like a very good Indian, and but he's doing, you know, what he can, and he's getting by, and he's running, you know, these virtual reality tours, and he's not sure what he thinks about the whole thing. He just wants to have friends and be liked, you know, and hopefully you come out the other end of that. I won't tell you what happens to Jesse or how it ends, but hopefully you come out the other end of that and you learn something about, you know, commodification of culture. Native stereotypes, you know, bad representation, appropriation of culture,
And what
things
far
like
too
that.
many natives actually experience as their reality. I think, you know, it was a
Right.
clever twist on the actual title.
Yeah.
Yeah. Though I think it's also important to understand that Trail of Lightning has all these fascinating and fabulous levels to it, but it is also a really great ride. You know, this is a book to read to have fun. This is a book that has, you know, the hot guy and the kick-ass girl and the big monsters and all of these things. I mean, so that's definitely there too. So I saw a hand here.
I'm Becca.
I see.
So what guided your decisions on what resources would be rare and relevant versus plentiful and available in this post-apocalyptic world? And also, why is coffee such a big deal? Is that the writer in you coming through? Like, oh God, coffee.
So I have to tell you that Sage read some of the early part of this story, and one of her things that she tagged in it was, why are they so obsessed with coffee? Because they are
There's a
obsessed with
great
coffee.
line. There's a great line. It says, one person says, well, he took my soul, and she says, well, you got off light, he took my coffee.
Right? Yeah, and honestly, that's just because I like coffee a lot. So yeah, there's nothing too deep in that. And you know, a lot of the, as far as like, you know, what is available in a post-apocalyptic world versus what isn't, you know, honestly, I looked at what's available on the res now. You know, like what do we have? What do we eat? Like, what would change? What wouldn't change? Like, I think most folks who haven't lived on, particularly like I've lived on the Navajo reservation, so that's my specific experience. But if you haven't lived there, you might be surprised. You know, you might be a little bit shocked about what you can and can't get in this day and age. I lived with my in-laws in 2008 or 9, and we didn't have running water. We had to haul our water. You know, we didn't have electricity always. We were on the generator a lot. And so I think that, you know, most people take all those things for granted. And so when the apocalypse happens and you're all dependent on your running water and your electricity, folks on the res are going to be like, it's another day. You know, we'll work it out. We'll make it work.
I I am so happy to be sitting here. It's just so tickling me. Actually, the part that you read in the book is the very first chapter, the very first thing I read of yours in our writing group. It
Yes.
scared the bejesus out of me, and I said, I can't read any of her stuff at night anymore. So I have a practical question as a writer. You also have a full-time job.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that, about how you've managed to become this successful published author with multi-book deal and also a full-time worker and the mother of a young girl and a wife and all those things.
Right, right. So it's sort of the work-life balance, right. So the secret is there is no work-life balance. It's all a lie. And I wrote this book, it took about, let's see, I guess I sold it in 2016. It took about 2 years to write and then a year to edit. It took a full year to edit it before I submitted it to any agents. And a lot of that was because I do work full-time and I work in sort of an intellectually demanding job. And I had to fit in the hours when I could. So I would work, bless my husband and my daughter for being patient, but I would work weekends, I would be out of the house by 9 o'clock and I wouldn't be back until, 9 o'clock at night. Or often during the weekdays, I put my daughter to bed and then I'd work from 9 to 1 or 2 in the morning. And so it's just something, if you want it, you find a way. And so that's what I did. And so it was tough, and it still is tough, because now that you're published, it doesn't get easier. Now you have deadlines, and now you have responsibilities to all these other people besides just yourself. So the easiest book you'll ever write is the one you write before you have a contract. Because then you can, I'll take the day off, and now you're just like, oh. So, yeah.
Yeah, Rebecca's an attorney.
Yeah.
Which is a common thing. I'm a recovering attorney. Steve's a recovering attorney.
And one day I will be a recovering attorney.
Yes, we're working on getting her to her recovery.
Yeah, but right now I'm still deep in.
Going back to you were talking about the representation and even just the last comment you said about the easiest book that you read is that first one. Not a writer, but an artist in a different way. And I feel like there's these 3 stages, like the stuff in your head before it comes out, and that's perfect because nobody else is.
Right.
It doesn't have to meet the outside world. And then the actual production of it when you're grappling with where it's located and all of these things. And then since it's a book, you have to work with a publisher, then what they want. You're touched on it a bit, like, did you struggle or how much, resistance or stuff did you run into, especially at the publishing level, like, did people want to push you into either minimizing your story of like, why does it have to be about trauma, why does it have to even touch on this, why can't it just be, or wanting to push the culture more than making it a spiritual Indian book, or something like that. Did you feel that, because it's perfect when it's just your perspective. The challenge happens when you meet the outside world. And so how much did you run into, ideally you find a perfect publisher that said, yeah, go for it.
No, actually I did find a great publisher, but one of the things, if you're going to do the traditional publishing route, is you have to query agents. You have to get an agent, right? And so I did go through that process. I sent out the story. I did my research. Let me step back. So I participated in a Twitter event called DV Pit, and now I can't remember what the D or the V stands for, but PIT stands for pitch. Diverse Voices Pitch, that's what it is. And so it's a day dedicated on Twitter where you try to pitch your story, and agents that were looking for diverse voices specifically say if they want you to query them. And there's all kinds of those. There's ones that are just science fiction and fantasy. There's ones called like Pit Mad, which is a big one, and I don't even know what their point is, but they exist. And there's like horror. So whatever genre you write in, you could probably find one of these contests for you. And I did do that, and I did get quite a few agents that were interested, but then I did my research, and none of them looked like a good fit. They were either looking for young adult, and my book is not young adult. It gets pegged as young adult quite a bit, so if you've seen that out there, I'm sorry about that. I
You
don't
know-
mean to mislead anyone.
If your teenager is reading it, great, you may wanna talk to them.
Right, yeah. There's
Make
nothing,
sure-
I think,
Make
well,
sure that
you
you know
heard
everything.
the horror elements, right? And that's about as gory as it gets, I think. Although, there are some really brutal deaths, so think about that.
And the bad boy is evil in some very real ways.
Is he?
Is he?
What is he? Yeah, no, I don't know.
I would say he is. I
Yeah.
would say given some of the things he's done to her.
Yeah,
he
right.
is.
Yeah, okay,
So-
fair enough, fair
Yeah.
enough. Yeah, you would be surprised how many people like a bad boy on,
Uh.
yeah. So, I didn't mean him, I meant him to be sort of a, well, I don't want to ruin it. Well, you're here. I meant him to be a little more of a Me Too movement kind of dude. Like, he's not really supposed to be attractive in that sense. It's supposed to be controlling and sort of dark. But I've definitely had readers respond to it and be like, oh my God, he has the hotness. And I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
Just, guys, you need to think about that,
Yeah.
right?
Especially when there's another hot guy, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, but should I finish my process thing or no?
Yes.
Yeah. Did I answer it at all?
Well, I guess, can you just sort of speak to,
Yeah, let me wrap it up.
what were the expectations in a mainstream publisher?
Yes, there you go. Okay, so some of them wanted to change my story, and those people I did not go with. I had one agent that was like, if you go YA, if you change this, I was like, well, what about the part where this person dies? Well, we'll have to change that. Well, what about the part when this happens? Well, we'll have to change that. Well, what about that ending? Yeah, we'll have to change that. So I knew she wasn't right for me, and even though she's like, we can make 6 figures on your advance, and she promised this pie in the sky sort of stuff, she didn't love my story for what it was. She loved my story for the potential that she could change it to be. So I knew she wasn't a good fit. And the same with, and so the agent that I did pick loved it as is. She thought it was perfect, you know, and so she trusted it, she trusted my voice, and she trusted the story, and that's the one I chose. So you just gotta believe.
Rose?
Question on, do you have a book tour that you're about to do? And are you marketing other things besides your book?
No, the book is it. No, I'm not marketing anything but that, and the stories that follow. So there's a whole series, so there'll be 4. And then I have a children's book, actually. So I do have a children's book coming out in 2019 on the Rick Riordan imprint. So any of you guys who have kids and they read Percy Jackson, or they know those stories, that author, Rick Riordan, he started his own imprint with Disney. And I was lucky enough to get involved in that. So I will have a kid's book in 2019.
Also Navajo.
Yeah, and also, yeah, but this is for kids. I kind of wrote it for my daughter. And that's about a 7th grade girl who basically gets to save the world. So that's a lot of fun. And then I'll have a sort of an Anasazi-inspired epic fantasy coming out in 2020. And that's sort of your matriarchal clan, cliff-dwelling clans, sort of, you know,
If
whatever.
charcoal culture had made it to the space age.
Yeah, it's a little planetary too, as Steve pointed out. So that's fair. But yeah, that should be a lot of fun.
Your book tour?
Oh no, well you can check my website, RebeccaRoanhorse.com, and I have a list of all the events that I'm going to do. I'm actually doing quite a few events with Lauren there, because her book, which is an awesome cyberpunk thriller, Implanted, is coming out, and so we're going to go around to Denver and to Albuquerque and a couple of places together. And then I'll be at WorldCon, and I'll be at Indigenous Comic-Con in November in Albuquerque, and I'll be at a few other places like that, but you can find them on my website.
You talked about how, there's very little real Indigenous representation in sci-fi and fantasy, and so I'm wondering if, kind of being at the vanguard of that, does that kind of light a fire under your butt to really get going and make you want to write all the time, or is it something that, do you ever feel almost paralyzed by the pressure of being more visible than most other Indigenous writers, and if so, how do you get past that and just finish the book?
Sure. Yeah, it's absolutely terrifying. I don't find a lot of joy in it, honestly, to be quite honest. I mean, it's exciting and it's fun, and I'm so glad everyone is here. and reading this and celebrating this and on social media talking about it. But I don't want to be the voice for like Native Americans. That's not I'm just a science fiction and fantasy writer. There are way more qualified and experienced and better voices than mine for that. I want to do my part to improve representation because it matters to me. If I'd had these stories when I was young, when I was reading, you know, the Belgariad and Wheel of Time and, you know, all these sort of questing, you know, farm boys, this would have changed my life. I can't even imagine. And so to be able to write these books and have, you know, the next generation come up and see themselves, see mirrors of themselves in genre fiction is exciting to me. So that part I love, that part I'm passionate about, and that part I'll do what I can to push that forward. But beyond that, I just want to write books.
Well, and something you're also very open about is Native culture is incredibly diverse. I mean, you know, you post on Facebook that somebody referred to this as what, Tony Hillerman, urban fantasy or something like that.
Yeah, sci-fi Tony Hillerman.
And that was not great, but I was like, hey, at least I got the tribe right.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, and so too often Native America is just sort of packed down into sort of generically brown and spiritual and connected to the earth. When, you know, we're talking about, you know, how many language groups do we have?
500, over 500.
500 tribes surviving nowadays.
Nations, yeah.
Yeah, and that doesn't count the countless others that did not survive to the present day.
Right, good point.
Are you continuing to work with your writing group, and do you share your works in progress still with that like core group of people?
Well, I've been lucky enough in the past few months to join this wonderful new writing group. Yay, Critical Mass. So I have Emily and Steve and Lauren and Serena, oh hey, and a few other folks. And so they are now my new writing group. And so yes, we share works in progress. And oh, let me just say my old writing group, Randy, is here. She's in the acknowledgement. She was one of the first people to ever read parts of my story. And Sage read some of it too. So I think the writing group is critical. I think it makes a huge difference to hear feedback in the early stages even, like when you're still sort of plotting and when you're still sort of figuring out character development and what rings true. Because like you said, it's all perfect in your head, you know, and then you try to get it down on paper and it comes out blah, blah, you know, and you're like, wow, that's not what I meant at all. But you don't know until someone like Emily reads it and goes, oh, well, you know what? This sounds like, you know, these guys are about to get together. And I'm like, oh, I didn't mean that at all. So.
Yeah, and then she's like, oh, but she's 9. I'm like, oh.
Yeah, it wasn't quite that bad, but yeah. We exaggerate. Yeah, but anyway, no, writing group is awesome and critical, and if you can get yourself one, get yourself one.
So we've asked a bunch about like your, thanks. We've asked a bunch about representation and how you feel being sort of this indigenous, capital I, fantasy writer and all of that. But I'm curious, like, what are some of your favorite fantasy and sci-fi stories? Like, what's inspired you to become a sci-fi and fantasy writer?
Right. So, you know, I dog a little on those epic Farm Boy Quest books, but I loved them, you know, as a kid. I read all of those and the Dragonlance Chronicles and, you know, who knows what else sort of fantasy. I love Dune. Dune by Frank Herbert was a huge influence in my childhood. I was like, spice and worms. I don't know what it was. Like, you know, and there is an indigenous population, of course, and you know, there are
and
things.
It brought in Middle Eastern culture. It brought in, you know, so which is kind of presented as this alien culture.
Yeah, I'm not sure it did that well. I'm not saying that your faves are problematic, but yeah, I love. And then, you know, I always say I sort of grew away from that epic fantasy and didn't read fantasy for a while, actually, in college until I discovered urban fantasy. And for those that don't know, urban fantasy was this genre that came up sort of in the late to mid-90s, often set in cities, often contemporary. So our world, but magic. And, you know, there'd be werewolves or vampires or, you know, that sort of thing. And often the protagonists were female. And so that was really different.
And a lot of the writers were female as well.
Yes. And there's some crossover into the romance genre and things like that. And so this, when I read that, I was like, oh, you can do that? You can write those? You can put a woman at the center of your fantasy story and she can, like, you know, kick ass and take names and, you know, still, you know, date the hot guy because I am shallow that way, but, you know, and I was like, wow, and they let you write that and they let you publish that and that is fantasy. And so that just sort of blew my mind and it opened up the genre again for me. And so I really fell in love with urban fantasy. And I read a ton of it, and then by the time I started to write my book, they said, oh, urban fantasy is dead.
It's gone.
Sorry, you're too late. Yeah, we've moved on, you know, to some other thing. Now it's post-apocalyptic. So I said, well, that's fine. You call it whatever you want.
And you did away with the urban, because we joke about
Right.
we call it rural fantasy or whatever.
Right. I guess it's
there is no
rural fantasy.
urban.
Yeah. There are no cities, clearly, but yeah.
Any other questions?
Hi, also a recovering attorney. It's like a support group we got going here. So I was just wondering if there was any origin story to the inspiration for the story or the characters. Did you think about it for a long time? Did you have a flash of inspiration like J.K. Rowling on a train? Did you run an RPG? Where did this sort of story, the characters, the elements come from?
Yeah, well, like I just said, I loved urban fantasy, and that is, you know, if you read the book and you're familiar with the genre, you're going to see a lot of those conventions, and that's on purpose, because I wanted to take these sort of familiar conventions, I wanted to mesh them with a post-apocalyptic world, then I wanted to put a little Western into it, and then I wanted it to all be Navajo. And so I remember I was actually at a law conference, and my specialty is federal Indian law, so it was like all these folks were all sitting around talking about federal Indian law. And I was doodling, and I thought, well, what if, you know, there was a monster hunter? And it kind of just went from there.
I can't imagine that your mind started wandering during a legal conference.
It's so riveting.
Yeah, by the lecture.
Yeah. So, yeah.
If we have reached the end of questions, what we're going to then do is transition over to the signing and cake eating portion of this program. But does anybody have any last questions before we start that transition?
Yeah, what's the next?
Okay, so here and then we'll head. So go ahead and start.
At the last Federal Indian Law Conference I went to, I sketched out 12 paintings.
Yay! There you go, my people. All right.
I just wanted to hear more of the book.
Oh, should I read a little more?
Yes.
Okay, I'll read just a little more and then we'll...
I think you should read to that horrific twist.
What was the short story you had mentioned that you would...
Oh, welcome to your authentic Indian experience.
Thank you.
And
if you Google it, it will definitely come up. Okay, so I'll read a little bit. We will catch up with Maggie, our character, after... I'm going to spoil it for you and tell you she kills the monster. I know it's shocking that on page 12, she's still alive. Sorry, Steve, but here we go. Dead. The monster is dead. I drop to my knees, exhausted, because what Honokahani gives, it takes away, and even that limited use of my clan powers has left me drained. My heart pounds like a big drum in my chest. The roar of a windstorm crashes in my ears, and the shakes are ridiculous. They rattle through my muscles as the adrenaline melts away. I scream, exhilarated, obscenely euphoric. I know this high, my clan power, a bloodlust that revels in the kill. Guilt and horror suffuse me, and I try to mentally push it away, but it won't be denied as long as I am covered in the blood of my enemies, his lifeless body at my feet. I listen as my voice echoes back to me through the trees and wait for the perversity of my killing clan power to pass. For a while, the only sound is my own breath in my ears, the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Dirt and rocks stick to my blood-soaked leggings and poke painfully at my knees as I crawl over to retrieve my knives. I clean them both as best I can, sheathe the obsidian blade. I use the Borker, German, to hack at what's left of his neck until the head comes off. I'm not sure what kind of monster I just killed, but I do know he took too damn long to die, and that makes me cautious. Taking the head is about the only way to guarantee he won't stand up the moment I turn my back. There's a shuffling behind me. I whirl too fast and my head throbs. If there's another monster, I'm in no shape to fight it. It's the girl. I forgot about the girl. She's dragged herself upright, back braced against a bare tree trunk. Her nightgown is torn and filthy. Her hair hangs in stringy blood-clotted clumps. The color in her face is an awful, ghostly chalk under her brown skin. I can see her wound now. The black blood, the white of bone and tendon showing through where the flesh has been scraped away by the monster's teeth. I shake off a shudder of horror and wonder how she's still alive. The monster wasn't just gnawing at her, he was trying to dig out her throat. She tries to talk, her mouth working soundlessly, but the damage is so bad she can't speak. Her eyes are big, wide, and glazed over. She can't be more than 12 years old. And as I'm looking at that wound, my gut says she's not going to make it to 13. I go to her, crouch down so we're close, eye to eye. She looks a little like me. The same dark hair, the same brown skin and broad, angular face. I still have the boker in my hand, but I keep it flat to the ground, out of sight. The monster got you, I tell her quietly. I point to the wound. Her eyes roll, trying to see the bloody place on her neck. Do you know what that means? A low, painful sound is all she can manage. Nesgane once told me that evil was a sickness. He told me he could see it on people like a taint, that the Bilaganas had it wrong, and evil wasn't just some spiritual concept or the deeds of a bad man. It was real, physical, more like an infectious disease. And you could catch evil if something evil got inside you. And once inside you, it could take you over, make you do evil things, destroy what you once cared for, hurt people you wouldn't have hurt otherwise, and eventually, kill. And if that happened, you ran the risk of becoming just another monster. He told me I had some of that evil in me, that I'd been touched by what happened the night he had found me, and that it manifested as my killing clan, and it made me strong, made me vicious when I needed to be. But it was a narrow road that I walked. I had to be vigilant not to let it grow, not to feed it unnecessarily, because my fate wasn't decided yet. I could be a monster slayer, or I could be a monster. I laughed it off when he told me this, said it sounded like superstition, old people's talk. Never mind that I was talking to an immortal. But the truth is, he'd scared the piss out of me, because I knew why he was telling me this. We were standing in a field of corpses at the time, his eyes on me, but as distant and unfathomable as the farthest corners of the universe. I was cleaning my boker on a dead man's coat, but the curl of Nesgane's lips and the pinch in his heavy brow told me clear enough what he was thinking. He was gone the next morning. Why he, the monster slayer, didn't just kill me if he thought I was becoming a monster, I'm not sure. But those years as his apprentice meant something. Maybe he had second thoughts about it all in the end. But here, facing this girl who doesn't look so different from me, it hits me like a punch in the gut. I think of giving her the speech Nesgane gave me, but I'm not cruel, just honest. I keep it simple. It means you're infected. Her wet panting grows louder. Even if you survive, the infection is only going to get worse. You'll have to fight it your whole life. It will dig into you, take you over. I swallow to clear my throat. I met your family back in town. They seem nice. I rub up my nose with the back of my hand where it suddenly itches. She stays where she sits, but her eyes, she sways where she sits, but her eyes stay on me. They would try to say the right things, try to fix things, fix you, but they won't understand. What's happened to you can't be fixed. It's the most I've said to another human being in months. But now that I'm talking, it feels urgent that she know, that she understand why I have to do what I'm going to do. The infection, I tell her, it'll make you something else inside, something that hurts people, something you don't want to be, something monstrous, I want to say. Do you understand? She swallows, and I can see the muscles of her throat working, slick and wet where they show through her ruined skin. I nod, tighten the grip on my knife. I want to tell her I'm sorry, but I settle for close your eyes. Her eyes flutter shut. I brush her hair away from her face, expose her neck. I murmur I'm sorry after all, and I tell myself she understands that I'm saving her, even if it doesn't seem like it. I swing the boker. Her head separates cleanly. Her body wilts to the forest floor. There's a hard ball in my stomach that bends me over, makes me want to heave. I try to ignore the way my knife suddenly feels heavy and wrong in my hand, how the familiar grip grates like sandpaper against my palm, and I can't but think that if this was the right thing to do, then why does it feel so fucking wrong? I stagger back from her body. The ground is littered with the carnage I have wrought in only a handful of minutes. I make myself take it in, the smells, the blood, the headless bodies. I commit it to memory. It's the stuff of nightmares. The forest around me is quiet, and whatever judgment it makes of me, merciful or monstrous, it keeps to itself. The bare kindling of the campfire sputters and hisses in the distance before it finally surrenders to the flames. Moments later, the flames die too, leaving me with only darkness and ash.